Oh, I was reading that article you sent, Price, about the Montreal Canadiens. That actually is dangerously based.
That is so good. All the sports writers are so upset that
I
they
know.
possibly draft a guy who Snapchatted a nude of his girlfriend to his buddies when he was 17. It's like, no, yeah, that's just, once you do that, you pretty much write him off, lock him up, life in prison. Shouldn't give him any sort of...
Yeah, he's underage when he did it. It's not a criminal record. It's fine.
Maybe just 5 years in prison, and then he has to dig coal for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
I think,
Plus castration.
Reasonable.
Yeah, you have to be reasonable. It was a nude, right? If he had actually done anything physical, that's where you just like shoot him in the head and leave him in a ditch.
Yeah, shockingly, Montreal cared about the hockey player rather than the actions of the hockey player when he was a kid. Like, oh,
there's definitely certain things where you would say
not draft him because he acted like an idiot once.
Yeah, it doesn't excuse the behavior, and you say, okay, that was a good thing he did, but nobody's saying that. Like, it's just...
Now, when you're in the midget team, like, the only disappointing thing is that it was a picture of his girlfriend and not a picture of one of the boys, full nude. Send it to the boy's mom.
That's a more classic fuck you, actually. Try to sneak a peek of one of the boys in the change room. Oh, man. No, it's just... And then... It's just crazy that people would, like, assume that drafting someone is, like, condoning their actions since they were born. Like...
I mean, it's in the contract. Before you draft this person, you have to look through their whole life history.
That's what all the, like, writers are... Like, all the Twitter morons are saying is, like, oh, like, by drafting him, you're saying that what he did is okay. It's like, what?
You have to be so disabled to think such a thing. It's like...
Well, it's like, it was so dumb is because it's like, okay, so people that hire employees out of prison, they're condoning what those people did.
Exactly, but no. We need to reintegrate those people into society because they just made a mistake. Yes, that man did murder somebody, but it was because he was a teenager, and you gotta reintegrate him into society. But this hockey player, you better chop off his balls because there's no forgiving such a horrendous action. It's like I don't know. It's such a weird logic. Like there's just lack of logic, really.
Chance ever mean that you're condoning their full slate of behavior? Seems such a fucking weird take. That has never been the standard in the history of the world.
And the best part was people are upset that they're going against his wishes when he said that he didn't want to be drafted because he didn't deserve it, because he needed to repent for his actions. It's like...
They violated his consent.
Yeah, how about it doesn't matter?
Teaching him a lesson about consent. Montreal Canadiens are teaching him a lesson. They're dangerously based.
Yeah.
They're saying, see, this is what it's like to have your consent violated.
Well, better lock up the Montreal team as well, or the management team, because this can't do with this.
No, Montreal's beauties. God bless.
It was like someone was going to take the heat. Like no one was going to pass on a first-round prospect who just did something in his 17-year-old's age.
I was hoping Montreal after their legendary run that built them up some goodwill. Can't stay like a league favorite or even somewhat liked in the league for the season with Montreal.
Back to the underdog status where all the reporters hate you. Like that was it was like they were doing fine in the playoffs till the reporters started to believe, and they're like, oh, we've always doubted Montreal before, maybe we need to stop doubting, and then they lost. It's like
it's just a strategic move overall for the organization. God bless.
You'd love to see it. Long-term planning.
Well, I guess we should talk about what we're actually supposed to talk about.
No, let's just talk about this the rest of the...
Hockey?
Yeah, exactly. There's now a hockey puck.
Montreal took quite a gamble.
I'm
fucking shut it down. Shut it down. Okay, with that amazing segue, thank you, Price. We'll launch right into our our segment for today, and that is gambling. We wanted to actually take a look into the books of gambling across the world and see actually what the extent of it is, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off. It seems like something that, like an activity that might have taken a pretty big bump up, but didn't really know anything about it, and thought it would be a good idea to dive in and see exactly like what the impacts are, like how many problem gamblers there are, what the cost of that is, and just what other types of gambling there are other than just like the classic ones like sports betting and a couple others. So, what were your guys' thoughts going into this, Hubbards?
I mean, like you were saying, I guess like the COVID kind of drove people online, and then that parlays into what I was thinking about is like online obviously just made gambling super accessible to everyone, and I guess legal and illegal. You can, if your region doesn't have legal online gambling, you can just use a VPN and go gamble. It's pretty straightforward for even low technology people to online gamble now, no matter what. And that also like extends to like kids because of like games, especially adding gambling mechanics like loot boxes. So you basically have every age group able to access easy forms of gambling. And the other thing I was just thinking, this is kind of what I remembered from psychology, was gambling is basically now treated as a behavioral addiction, and maybe for some people that seems obvious, but for a long time it wasn't. It was not treated as an addictive behavior. And another thing I was going into this is like just I guess talking to people more or less. It seems like people gamble quite a bit, and there's a very like blasé, oh, it's not a big deal, whatever, it's just kind of some harmless fun attitude. It's kind of like drinking in that sense, I feel like, and that led me to believe that it's probably a bigger problem than anyone really acknowledges. Just like drinking, you actually go dig down into the numbers on drinking or whatever. But I think gambling's probably even worse because it doesn't have like the visible consequences like drinking does. That's about it.
Yeah, I think the drinking analogy was also something that I had thought of going into this, in that pretty much everybody, by everybody I mean like 80% of the population, so there are full communities that don't gamble or don't drink, but everybody in the colloquial sense gambles or drinks, and most people don't have significant ill effects on their life. And I was thinking through all the different things that could be thought of as gambling, and one of the big ones that I think really saw a huge jump during COVID was using the stock market as a way to gamble. And you could argue, if you wanted to stretch the definition of gambling, that any investment is kind of a gamble because you're putting in money expecting a greater monetary return. But you can consistently win, so like there's not that sort of negative side. You just can't consistently win big, and it becomes gambling when you try to win big, especially with options tradings and Robinhood and all those sort of things that made it way more accessible to average Joes, in which case it becomes effectively to them an online casino. I've even heard Robinhood is like set up in a casino fashion where you get a bunch of banners and rewards and sounds that play. So it's come to the forefront, but I think the stock market in general might be able to be seen as the most productive use of humans' innate tendency to gamble, to want to put capital at risk to receive an increase in capital. And then obviously sports gambling, huge. Everyone knows about that. Horse racing needs to make a comeback though. That's the classic.
And dog racing.
Don't know about dog racing. Like, I know it's classic, but I think horse racing is like the classic. Like that's going all the way back to like the Roman times. What risk when dog racing was. Probably even Egyptians were horse raced. That's another thing I was thinking about is gambling as a form of money, risking money to make money, has to date back to early agrarian societies. People just didn't have that thrill in their life that they used to have. The one that slips on the radar, I think, is sweepstakes, where roll up the rim or anything along those lines. You buy a product that you probably would have bought anyway, so it's not a big deal, and then you have a chance to win. So it's kind of a way of advertising. And in Canada, you have to legally provide a way for people to enter those sweepstakes without buying the product. Therefore, it's not legally considered gambling, because you don't have to make the purchase. You can read the Tim Hortons about why you should be included in the roll up the rim sweepstakes, and they have to include you, something along those lines. It's difficult but possible. But that has led to the loophole of sticker sales, which has become a big thing, also driven online influencers, and they'll sell you a sticker of their brand logo or something along those lines, or a hat, and it'll be worth $5 maybe, and they'll sell it to you for $150, and then you're entered in the sweepstakes to win something that's much more expensive, and you have a decent odds of doing it. And that is definitely a problem that is flying under the radar under the sweepstake laws. Oh, and the younger generation, loot boxes are just triggering them like crazy. They're going nuts for loot boxes. But back in my day, collectible cards were the thing, and those have been
Card packs,
playing
yeah.
kids for a long time.
Those have been around for
1800s.
Yeah, I was gonna say those have been around for decades and decades.
The scale of the problem is just nowhere near what it is with digital loot boxes. But the end result is like you get a digital avatar or something that you can show off to your friends or collect. So it has the same sort of addictive properties of collectible card games, but in a much more easy to consume package.
Well, and a big part of both card games and loot boxes is a lot of this, like the loot is tradable and sellable, right? So that's another like big attraction is kids can, well, anyone can trade them with each other, complete their collection, sell them, etc., right? Like they actually have value outside of whatever narrow field they're acquired in.
Oh, and in the same vein, some games they do loot boxes specifically where you can't trade things, and then that means that you can't trade things to your friends. So if you want to get something, you have to get it yourself, which then makes you have to wail on it.
Yeah, exactly. Buy more.
I think that'd be more effective for older people that actually have access to the capital.
That's a lot of before thoughts. You have
Yeah, I was gonna say. For me, not a lot more. Just one extra thing. It just feels like gambling is obviously one of those problems, because it clearly is a problem for certain people. Like, I would say everybody probably knows at least one person who's had severe damage to their life in general from gambling. But because it's going to be one of those problems that does not have some sort of easy solution, otherwise we would have already dealt with it. To me, it just seems patently obvious that if there was like a way that you could properly deal with it, it's just like alcohol, like you guys were saying. You know, if you had an easy way or a really effective way, you would have already had massive reductions in it, and that does not seem like, from at least my cursory understanding.
That's what you'd hope, but at the same time, there are jurisdictions such as Ontario that are actively trying to increase the revenue they receive from their lottery operations and gambling operations, which runs counter to the ideal of reducing the amount of harm caused by these.
Yeah, that's true. There's definitely some places who are trying to amp it up as much as you can, but
the revenue source is a hard number on paper, and the societal costs are like a soft thing that can be hand-waved away.
Yeah, and that was one of my other thoughts before, is there's a lot, I would guess that it's very hard to quantify the actual impacts of gambling, so it flies under the radar, and there's probably a hell of a lot of societal costs that if you were able to quantify it would make people very upset with it in general, and would make it a lot less tenable of like a societal entertainment source. And that was really the only things I had additional to you guys. I also had the same thoughts on loot boxes, and then also it feels like crypto's another huge one that blew up over the
Yeah, that's a good one.
pandemic as people
If you're
started
not
going.
1,000 times leverage, why are you even in the crypto market?
Yeah, it's just like I knew people were contacting me about getting into crypto because I, like, within my friend group had a bit more knowledge on crypto, and it was clear that the people who were contacting me, they were looking to get into it as a form of gambling rather than like long-term investing. They just wanted to make a quick buck on it. Oh man, that's not good. But yeah, other than that, that's all I really had. So I think we can just move straight on to the research. So what did you guys discover about just, I would say, like global statistics, country statistics, just like what's the industry like? Is it bigger or larger than you thought, or is it, much more widespread?
Oh man, it's hard to tell like whether it's bigger or not than you'd think because numbers don't mean anything anymore.
Yeah,
Like
true.
you hear, like I don't know, I saw one stat that about 71 billion was spent by Americans on lotteries in 2017. I don't know, 71 billion seems like a huge number. There was another survey done for the same year that put an estimate at $1,038 per year spent on lottery tickets per respondent. So I'm assumedly be adults only. And that seems like a lot. This was just for lotteries in the States. That's a huge chunk of your, disposable cash going to lottery tickets. And there's a couple interesting things about those surveys as well. Is I think, at least for me, a big stereotype was people in lower income brackets are probably going to be more likely to play lotteries. See it as like chance to make it big, right? Like they're down on their luck. They're not doing well. Lotteries seem like very attractive to that group as like a source of hope, essentially. False hope, I guess, but hope nonetheless. And they're actually like the lowest income groups are definitely the least likely to play lotteries, which I guess if you think about it a little more, it does make sense. They just don't have the disposable income to spend on it.
Yeah, if you're at the very lowest income brackets, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because then it does like pretty much level off at fairly comparable for higher incomes. Like the only group that is noticeably different is the lowest 20% income bracket. And then age groups was another kind of interesting thing. You'd think maybe young people, they're a little bit more risk-taking, they're a little bit more, kind of big dreams, big hopes. I thought, younger people would be probably skewed a little bit more to play the lottery, but they're actually like the least likely. The most heavy lotto players are 65 to 74-year-olds, which is a weird group. I guess they just have nothing better to do. A lot of disposable income because they're just retired and not much to spend it on. So
not much to do, right?
Yeah, like there's just not a lot else to spend their money on, but like they spend a lot more than any other group. Pretty crazy. Although if you look at like percentage of income, this was from the same survey. Americans earning less than $30,000 said that they spend on average 13% of their total income on lottery tickets.
13%?
13%.
That's crazy.
And so that was from just one survey. It wasn't that huge, so I don't know how accurate that number is, but pretty insane.
What I saw for Ontario was that the poorest 20% of Ontarian households spend 5% of their household income gambling each year. So I guess if one person in your household is gambling, that could be 10% of your house of their income. And then the highest income families spent under 2% of their household income gambling each year. But with gambling, it seems like there's nothing I would treat as wholly reliable numbers. It seems like a really difficult field to put numbers on things.
Yeah, and that goes back to like this. A lot of the data you'll get is obviously on legal um, gambling, right? Like, so it'll be like state-sponsored lotteries, casinos, etc., etc. And again, the numbers are very murky, but it seems like the illegal gambling markets are probably as big, if not bigger, than the legal ones. And
so numbers I've had in Canada for that is 17 billion in the legal market of revenue, and an estimated 14 billion in the illegal market. So almost the same size.
and for Canada, you'd expect Canada to be the one that skews pretty heavily towards legal, right? Because a lot of our gambling is legal.
Yeah, it's not like
So,
the
yeah.
States where you have to. You can only
You
have a
think-
casino in very particular areas. Canada's can have it wherever.
Yeah, you'd think like a lot. Yeah, state like the United States is going to be obviously skewed more heavily towards illegal because they're so much more restrictive on their gambling. I'm going to make the assumption that is not going to be very effective in keeping the numbers down. So you're just going to have a larger percentage of your market in the illegal category. So, again, who's to say whether or not respondents in a lot of these things include their illegal gambling in their, estimates or whatever, or like the one I was looking at was a labor force survey from StatsCan. I don't know how much of the illegal market they would capture, but it's probably not all of it. So a lot of the numbers you get are probably underestimates of how much people spend on gambling, right?
Yeah, one of the big things I would imagine is that the absolute atrociously wealthy people who are gambling addicts probably don't spend it in a way that can be tracked.
How so though?
Potentially.
Like, what do you mean? Like, it can't be tracked? Like, just on the
Oh,
online
go to
illegal?
Hong Kong and
Mhm.
spend $2 million betting on horse races or something, and that's not going to get picked up in the like statistics of how much people spend gambling. I would
Yeah.
doubt. And that is, I think, one of the big downsides of illegal gambling or even overseas gambling is that money is being taken as revenue in another country, basically leaving your cycle of spending in your country.
Yeah, exactly. It gets
$14
siphoned
billion
directly
in
out.
Canada, that could be $14 billion of raw value could actually be 28 billion or 36 billion of GDP just gone.
Yeah, and another interesting thing, I guess it does make intuitive sense, is like the types of gambling obviously are very different, and people spend different money, and they have different patterns, right? So, say the lottery, if you look at the numbers, again, not the most reliable, but usually over, pretty much any source you look at, half or more of people say they play the lottery, but they don't spend a ton. Like the median spending on something like the lottery, it's not very high, and that makes sense because it's not a very high intensity thing, in the sense like you're not in front of a machine, kind of just buy the ticket, wait for the draw. You got that little thing in the back of your mind thinking the draw is coming out, but it's not like that intense or grabbing of an experience. And when you compare it to something like slot machines, not many people play slot machines. In Canada, the difference is, say, about 55% people say that they play the lottery versus around 10 to 15% saying that they play slot machines or casinos. But they spend a lot more on, like, the people that do play slots spend a lot more money.
Yeah, they drag up the average, right?
What I saw is that the majority of Ontario's revenue from gambling is from slot machines. And so I have two numbers, one of which is that 88% of gaming revenue is from slot machines. I'm not entirely sure if I don't think that counts lotteries when they say 88%. And then for their entirety of the Ontario Gambling Commission that counts lotteries, it's think it's 56% of their total revenue for that institution over the last 20 years has come from slot machines, and only about 10% of gamblers exclusively use slot machines, and only 20% of gamblers even go to casinos.
Exactly, and that's actually been like a well-known thing about casinos in general, is they make all their money on the, well, not all, but the vast majority of money that casinos make is on their slot machines. They don't make a lot of money on their tables. They rely on slot machines for revenue. So, and again, that does make sense given the psychology, right? Like, slot machines are very much made to grab your attention and keep it, right? And I mean, that does segue into, you know, talking about gambling as an addiction. You do see people chase, you know, say with something like slots, chase that reward of winning and get addicted to it, and they will blow through their life savings on it.
Oh yeah, lose their house and everything. One of the pieces of research I came across was just what happened when Australia brought in slot machines, like they call it. They're like poker machines, but they operate in the same type of way, and as a slot machine. And they brought them in '92, and then they had a huge problem with them because you could just stick them in bars and whatnot, like it was just completely not regulated. And this one of the stories was like a lady. She just went from, you know, she just tried it once because she was bored, and it turned from that to her literally losing everything, like just everything.
So, and then on the inverse, Norway, their attempt to deal with slot machines, because they were already there, was to ban them for several years. And now what they've done is put a mandatory limit to the amount players can gamble and compulsory breaks in play when you're on a slot machine. Because
where was that? In Australia?
Norway.
Oh, Norway.
That was Norway. So that's like the inverse. Australia brought them in, they just wreaked havoc. And Norway, they were wreaking havoc, and they attempted to deal with it. And I couldn't find data on how successful that was, but presumably more successful than doing nothing.
Yeah,
I think that makes sense with people. It probably meshes with people's experience, right? Like, I don't know. I don't think many people would have experience knowing someone who, you know, went broke buying lottery tickets. I mean, I'm sure it happens, but it's the rare case, right? Like the real problematic of gambling, it seems, is that instant gratification version where you pull the lever, do whatever you're supposed to do, and the winner loss is right there. It's very variable reward schedule, and they use every, you know, psychological trick in the book to make it as addictive as possible, and you just sit there playing until you have no money left, right? That's kind of how slot machines are set up.
yeah, they're extremely exploitative.
Well, and just to give some background on like the psychology, for a lot of time, gambling was treated as like a compulsion issue, meaning that it was seen as something people do to relieve anxiety. Essentially, like they would have a compulsion to gamble, and when they did gamble, they would like lose anxiety, whereas in addiction it's more like they're chasing a reward over and over and again. And in the DSM-5 they did move it from a compulsion disorder to an addiction, into the addiction section as a behavioral addiction. And it definitely does seem much more to fit with an addiction. Like they do see a lot of the similar changes in the brain that addictive drugs show, specifically to do around like dopamine pathways. And you basically, the more you play, the more dysregulated your dopamine system gets, and that's also like you essentially lose connection with your executive control. So it becomes as like the more you do, say, addictive drugs or gamble, the harder it is for you actually to exert control on your impulses. So it just like feeds on itself, making it even worse. and they have actually seen more success using, say, drugs and treatment therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy to treat gambling than they ever did than they ever saw with success using like compulsion related treatments. They never like compulsion related treatments when they tried it on gambling was completely useless.
It's funny to me from a historical psychology perspective, because the sort of slot machines of the psychology world could be Skinner boxes, and you could easily train a rat to have the same problems that people slot machines in a box. And I think any psychologist would agree that the rat's not pressing that lever in order to relieve its anxiety. But psychology a lot of times becomes very political when it gets into what goes into the DSM and how it goes in there. And it's just like, it seems like a clear-cut example of it being a bureaucratic shit show.
Yeah, I feel like the DSM-5 has been
well,
very...
obviously it improves. I think it improves every time, but it improves at a slower rate than you would wish.
Yeah, and I think that's just kind of, again, maybe a little bit of academia being divorced from reality. I don't think if you ever saw someone playing slots or saw someone gambling and winning, that you would say that they're relieving anxiety versus chasing a reward.
Yeah, look how much lack of anxiety that person. He's just ecstatic. He has so little anxiety right now.
Just like, you know, that your typical gambler is just, you know, going nuts when they win, right? Like just ecstatic, and then, you know, frustration while they lose until their next big win, and then it's again ecstasy, right? It's very
well, a lot of the ecstasy, well, a lot of the actual drive comes from the anticipation when they spin, like if they're on a slot, crank the shaft, right? It's not even the win half the time. A lot of it is driven in the anticipation.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. With any addiction like that, that's anticipation is a big part of it. But again, that is a reward. Like it's anticipation of reward, not anticipation of anxiety reduction, right? Like
yeah, exactly. It's anticipation of the reward. They're not exactly.
I don't think you could really, make a good argument that some gambler sitting there, waiting for their anxiety to go down. It's like, oh, can't wait for my anxiety to go down so I can go home from the casino. Like, it would be weird. And, even if you, like, interview ex-problem gamblers, they always, like, talk about their big wins and how, like, they chase the big win again and again and again, right? I guess a little bit more on that for numbers, because part of what we were trying to look at is how big of a problem it is. I saw the numbers quoted from researchers saying that about 2 million Americans are addicted to gambling, and this is a little old, so it might be higher now, but about 10 times that number, so around 20 million people, gambling interferes seriously in their social or work lives, which seems bad. Like, if that's like the criteria they were using and 20 million Americans hit that criteria, that's seems to me a fairly significant problem.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, because that's closing in on about 10% of the entire American adult population that has a habit that seriously interferes with their social work lives. That habit obviously needs some scrutiny because that's not good.
Well, and look at the way that things like depression and anxiety, which are also things that severely interfere with your social and work life, are treated in society. And granted, I think the lifetime prevalence rate for those is more around 30%, but it's just night and day. Like, you don't see the sort of concern with the prevalence of gambling addiction.
No, there's not even a lot of research. Like, one of the things I noted was there just seems to be just a dearth of research for what the problems are, how to deal with them, what actually works, what doesn't work.
One thing I've noticed is a lot of very clearly pro-gambling research, where they made sure to state this percentages in such a way that implied gambling wasn't a big problem, or to give revenue numbers and like benefits to the community from a statistical monetary standpoint, rather than focus on the actual social impacts of gambling. The biggest one I saw was that in a self-report, 2% of gamblers thought of themselves as problem gamblers, but only 15% of gamblers had never thought they were being excessive while gambling, which means 85% of gamblers in that self-report thought that at some point they had been excessive in their gambling.
Or viewed themselves as problem gamblers.
Well, no, that was a 2% that viewed themselves as problem gamblers. So it's
Yeah.
most people don't think they're a problem gambler ever, but 85% of people think that they've excessively gambled in their lives, or 85% of gamblers think that they've done so excessively in their life.
Which means, yeah, although, I mean, you could make a favorable interpretation saying, you know, it's just like how many drinkers would say they've excessively drank and yet don't consider themselves to be problem drinkers, and probably aren't problem drinkers to a certain extent, right? Like, but I do agree, like, and I mean, it makes sense, like, where do you think which way is the money pointing? Obviously in favor of researching, you know, pro-gambling. I'm sure there's not a lot of money in, you know, gambling counseling or whatever. Like, there's going to be huge interest in making gambling look good.
I think particularly the thing that's surprising me about this is that I would think people who had excessively gambled would have done so predominantly in casinos and such, but just by that 85% number, that a large number of these people would consider themselves to excessively spend on presumably lottery tickets or maybe scratch and win tickets, because that many people don't go to casinos.
Scratch and win, I could see though being much more problematic, right? Like, because it is that instant gratification kind of game playing variable reward thing. Like Lotto 6, you know, I guess what is it? Is that BC only? Lotto 649? Like, the lotteries are just not, I don't think, as compelling. Although, just going off to another point on addiction, like, there's just no awareness, it seems. Like, 80% of, I saw research saying 80% of gambling addicts never seek treatment. So 4 out of 5. I don't know, you're paralleling with anxiety and depression. I don't know what the numbers are for anxiety and depression, but it's probably not quite that high.
Yeah, it's definitely not that.
And you just, like, at least personally, I just don't, you know, you don't see advertising about it. You don't see just pretty much anything in the zeitgeist going like, oh, you know, gambling is fucked up. Like, you know, if you have a gambling problem, go get treatment or whatever. Like, you always see, like, memes and everything about depression, anxiety, etc. Like, get treated. And, like, whenever quote-unquote mental health comes up, anxiety, depression is basically the interchangeable with that, with quote-unquote mental health. And, you know, it's always like, oh, there shouldn't be any stigma, go get, you know, treated. And yeah, fair enough, great, but, like, I think gambling maybe deserves a little bit of inclusion in there, because it's just insane, like, that there's a fairly substantial population of gambling addicts, most of which don't get treated. And then of the 20% who do seek treatment, apparently 75% of them doesn't work and they go back to gambling. So that's 5%. You're left with 5% of gambling addicts that ever effectively get away from it. That's pretty crazy.
Well, that definitely points towards it being very innate, like all the aspects of the factors that are played on. Very difficult to get away from. I think in BC, I used to see ads that said, know your limit, play within it.
They still have those.
Saying. But in Ontario, because as I said, they decided they needed to increase their revenue from gambling in the province, they spend $282 million marketing gambling. It's like, what?
No credit limit, max it out. That's the Ontario motto.
So their prevention, treatment, and problem gambling research budget is $64 million. So it's 1/4 of their advertising budget.
You gotta pay for dollar beer somehow.
Yeah, well, that's where Ford's finding his 5 cents in every dollar he was gonna pull out. It's all in gambling.
Just pump up the gambling revenue. Yeah, I mean, that is another interesting thing about gambling. Is that not only is there private interest, right? Obviously, in casinos, whatever, that would want to pump out pro gambling research. You don't even have a counterweight of like the government, because so many governments make a shitload of money on gambling, right? Like
Yeah, why would you cut off your revenue source?
Yeah, like even in the states, most states have a state lottery that rakes in billions or hundreds of millions. Canada, pretty much every province, I think, runs a state lottery, makes big money. State casinos like BC, Ontario, yeah, they all make crap loads of money on gambling. They have no incentive to crack down on it, and they're just as happy to see pro gambling research get pumped out, year after year, because they don't want their cash cow challenged.
Yeah, I think Ontario's gambling revenue in 2019 was $2.5 billion, which is pretty large for a province.
Not large enough for them.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, they want more. Do we want to go into maybe some of the alternative forms of gambling coming along?
Yeah, I think that's
fancy stuff.
Yeah, the new stuff, the newfangled things.
Oh, the new one that's not new, that's coming into Canada as of a bill that just passed last month, that was in the works for 10 years, is legal single-game sport betting. And that is going to capture between $4 and $8 billion of the current illegal sport betting market. That's the figures that people are theorizing. And so it's not new, everyone knows about sports betting, but it's going to involve a bunch of apps and online stuff, which is the new frontier. And you can go on your phone and you can say, Montreal's going to score 4 goals this game, give me the odds, and you can bet that. Like, you can bet a bunch of like really nuanced stuff like that. And it was a huge push during the playoffs. All of these gambling companies advertising information like that, what you can bet on, how you can bet. The NHL made a killing. And it hadn't even been legalized during the Stanley Cup playoffs until maybe the final. But they all knew it was going to be legalized, and they were just pumping millions of dollars into advertising, so you knew their apps.
Are you able to bet on which team drafts the black sheep prospect?
I wouldn't even be surprised, but you might have to go to Vegas for that. Like, Canada might just not be a big enough market.
Oh man, that's too funny. Yeah, sports betting is huge, and I know people were doing it well before it was legal in Canada, so I'm assuming there's I don't actually know where. I think several places in Europe it's legal, and I think so you can just VPN, like, it's not hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, I knew people that was like a big one, betting on sports. It's just then you're more invested in the games, but you're going to watch anyway. And
yeah, it genuinely increases your experience, your emotional investment, and you feel like you have some degree of knowledge about what you're doing. It's not just a shot in the dark.
You feel like that, but it is a shot in the dark.
Well, that's the dream for any sort of form of gambling. Make the person feel like they're in control.
true.
Yeah, exactly.
Somewhat tangentially related to sports betting was election betting, because I was following just like the crazy elections in the last, I guess, decade essentially, and the big thing was the best way to predict who's going to win the election is just checking the sports odds or the betting odds, because it's just more effective at integrating all the known information because there's money on the line. So the sports or the betting odds for elections are way more accurate usually than even the polling data at predicting who's going to win. And similarly, they make a lot of money on election betting as well.
Yeah, they rarely find a way to lose on a popular betting system.
But I do also see some some societal issues with allowing people to bet on things like that. I know that there's now like a lot of crypto based websites where you can bet on all sorts of weird societal issues, essentially.
I'd imagine that
on.
is going to become a bigger and bigger topic or betting area.
Well, yeah, I'm just checking a few of them right now. Like right now, you can bet on whether or not the U.S. is going to have a fourth wave of COVID.
Man, you win money on that all friggin' day.
Yeah, like it's pretty wild. Like what you can.
Now that Biden's in office, what's the criteria? Because he's declaring a fourth wave as soon as he can.
I actually think it goes the other way. I think he wants it to be over.
No, he's going to pin it on Trump, is 100%, and Trump's supporters, because, I mean, that's actually accurate.
Well, actually, the least vaccinated people are blacks, and then the next is Latinos.
No, but you look at, like, the counties with the lowest vaccination rates are like, directly correlated with who they voted for.
That's true. But, if you break it down by ethnic group.
Yeah, but you don't have to break it down by ethnic group. Break it down by voter group. All those blacks probably voted for Trump too. You know, he had a ton of black votes if you listen to the exit polls.
That's true. He did actually get a lot more.
Man, yeah, okay. You can bet on will LeVar Burton be the next host of Jeopardy. You can bet on whether or not the new Ethereum thing will be implemented by a certain date. You can bet on how many U.S. residential sales will the U.S. Census Bureau report for June.
Man, is that like Price is Right rules, where if you go over, you lose?
You can just it's a restricted range, 600,000 to 900,000 sales.
Oh, okay.
You can bet on whether Britney Spears' father will be removed or resign from her conservatorship.
It's just so dumb.
You can bet on anything pretty much. And I do see like there being, I think like as those markets expand, I could see there being a problem with that, and maybe if there's enough money into it, being some very unfortunate incentives for people to push different things in certain directions to make a buck.
Man, that would actually be... Yeah, just wait for the insider trading when you're an Ethereum dev and you bet that Ethereum wouldn't roll out Ethereum 2.0 until this date, and now all of a sudden your team has a problem that has to delay Ethereum until this date.
Thankfully, all these anonymous casinos are sure to regulate things like conflict of interest.
This is a brave new world.
Yeah, and I mean, that does kind of segue into another interesting, this is kind of like a side story, but it does highlight how the online world is just gobbling up gambling, or gambling's gobbling it up, the online world up one way or the other. There was a huge string of scandals in a computer game, CSGO, where people were basically making gambling sites for the skins you could get in the game from the loot boxes, and multiple websites were launched where streamers were advertising the website without advertising that they were the owners of the website. So they were saying that, oh, I'm playing on this new gambling website. It would be like, you know, you have a TV show about playing at a casino, and you don't tell the viewers that you own the casino, and you're sitting there gambling and pretending
Making bucks.
pretending to win big and lose big, and it's all house money because you own it. And the other craziest thing is several of them were caught changing the odds on the sites on the back end so that they could win. And a lot of these were like multiplayer pots. So you'd be playing with other players, so they're basically screwing over their sometimes viewers and sometimes just friends by putting the odds in their favor and scooping these jackpots that presumably their friends or viewers or whoever else was playing with them would have should have had an equal chance of winning, and doing this on stream to advertise while owning the website, just like multiple layers of scum, like insane conflict of interest and scumbag behavior. And a lot of them did get like, well, all of these CSGO ones got shut down due to the company owner of CSGO sending cease and desist because they didn't want to have anything to do with the skeezy underbelly of gambling. But yeah, nobody really got any real consequences in terms of.
Well, I know it did blow up a couple of the guys' careers who were doing it, so but it was no real legal
There's no legal
issues.
consequences.
Yeah.
Like the he investigated a couple of them, but they gave them they basically settled with them because they were able to hide behind the fact that it wasn't real gambling, or they said it wasn't real gambling because it was just video game skins, which they were able to spin as not having value or whatever. Just so, I think you're gonna see more and more of that come up.
My favorite workaround for the not real money or not legal tender, because that's usually what it's defined as in the law for gambling, is in Japan, where they've been doing this for about 70 years. You go to a store and you buy ball bearings, and then you go down the street to the pachinko parlor and you put these ball bearings into the machine and you play the pachinko game with the ball bearings, and then they pay out in ball bearings. And then if you have any ball bearings left, or potentially have made more than you came there with, you go back to the store that you bought the ball bearings from in the first place and sell them your ball bearings for money. And you were never gambling.
That store must have just a very quick and rapid variable demand for ball bearings. Interesting.
Yeah. And it's like, this is like the prototype that the rest of the world is moving towards, but with fancier digital tech.
Yeah, and one of those has been cryptocurrency with people. So there's a lot of online casinos that run on cryptocurrency, and as far as I understood it, part of the reason they were doing cryptocurrency was to skirt the legal tender rules for a lot of jurisdictions, right? Because they say, oh, you're not playing with USD, you're not playing with a legal tender, you're playing with a cryptocurrency, which is, in a lot of places not even defined in any meaningful way in the law. So they can get around a lot of regulations by you have to convert your money into cryptocurrency, transfer the cryptocurrency to the casino. So you can't buy the cryptocurrency at the casino. You just transfer it to your casino account, play in it, and then transfer it out. And then it's also much harder to trace all those transactions, right? Another reason to use cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I feel like crypto, once people, I think as it becomes much more widely known, and I think over the pandemic it really blew up into the public consciousness, I feel like it is going to, I bet you there is just ungodly sums of money in the crypto gambling area. You know, even people who are not that techie, right? If they want to go get their gambling fixed in an area that they can't.
Not techy enough to use a VPN, but techy enough to use crypto. It's a niche market.
Some of them, you have to do both, or like it's a whole cesspool of, they are trying to skirt. It's no surprise that most of these crypto casinos are run out of Eastern Europe or Central America. Like, it's, oh wow, like, oh, they're all centered in Panama. Who would have guessed? They're not, they don't have a headquarters in, the US or France or whatever. Like, they are intentionally trying to keep out of the reach of the more strict jurisdictions legal grasp, right? And another just side story on the crypto casinos, there's been a huge push for a lot of streamers and stuff, influencers I guess is the better term, to play these crypto casino games on on their stream or whatever they used to advertise essentially, and there's huge money in it. Some of them are getting paid millions a month to do this. So
Actually absurd. You get
If
paid.
we-
Think about that. You get paid millions of dollars a month to promote this crypto gambling.
Well, think about it the other way. The gambling side is making so much money. That it makes
That's
sense for them.
that's what I was
worth it.
just gonna say. It's like that means that crypto company is making so much money it can afford that. That just shows there has to be billions of dollars in the crypto gambling scene. It's just like
100%,
billions.
because you're not going to spend $2, $3, $4 million a month and not make more than that on the people coming into play from that advertising, right? So
Yeah, you're not going to actually put yourself in the red on advertising. Like that's just
and
not.
They are paying dozens of streamers millions of dollars a month, or at least probably a dozen, millions, right? So it's got like the total amount going to influencers to pump these things has got to be in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, it's ludicrous, right? So that means easily that they're making billions of dollars a year total, right, across the different segments. And I was trying to look into what the total online gambling market is. I couldn't find a good estimate. I don't know if either of you guys came. I saw there was this one EU Commission report thing that said 71 billion that seemed to be legal. I saw another source saying that the illegal gambling markets, and this would be online and offline, is $1.5 trillion a year. That seems I couldn't track down where they estimated that from, but that seemed high. But anyway you slice it, it's probably got to be in the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars.
So what the figures I found for regular gambling in 2016, they thought it was worth, like, all above board gambling was 400 billion. And I would guess that illegal gambling is, like, if Canada's any, we have pretty liberal laws here in Canada, and almost the equivalent size of the legal gambling market we have in illegal gambling here. So even if you, like, just say, give or take, 10-20% on either side, you're probably looking at least hundreds of billions of dollars in the illegal gambling across the world. Now, maybe Canada's an odd one out, and it's, the illegal gambling's way larger, or maybe even smaller than what, like, is generally seen across the world. But I guess it would be not a half bad estimation.
And yeah, that just seems, for your average person, not a good use of money, right? Like, I mean, it's really hard to say what you can put, what is and isn't valuable. That that turns into a whole philosophical discussion, but I can't imagine spending a large percentage of your income every year on gambling is healthy or good for you or valuable. Maybe spending a small percentage, if you get some good entertainment out of it, not a bad idea. Not a bad use of your entertainment dollars, but
Yeah, exactly, which is why you don't want to just flat out ban gambling, because one, it drives it underground, and two, people people should be free to do what they like with their money, right? So long as they're grown-ass adults, which does come to the loot box question. But
again, that's another whole philosophical tangent on how much we should allow people to harm themselves, etc., etc. But I generally agree that as long as you're not completely torpedoing your finances, and you're just want to go to the casino and have fun for a weekend in Vegas or whatever once a year, that's fine. But as I think with some of the numbers we've given, it seems like there's a good chunk subset of gamblers that aren't able to keep it at reasonable levels. And then even just for people in the lower income brackets, as a per capita expenditure, it's just creeps up, and I'm sure they could use the money on other things that are much more pressing, right? Do we want to touch on loot boxes?
I think so. I think that's actually an important thing because I think the morality there is a lot more clear cut. But I think most people don't really even know it's a problem.
I don't think it's any more clear cut, except specifically in the case of children and games marketed.
Yeah,
towards
that's what
children.
exactly what I mean. Where it's gonna be there, like it's pretty clear cut there.
Yeah, but I think most of the money. I mean, I'd be terrified if it wasn't the case that most money from loot boxes is generated off of adults that play video games.
You'd be surprised. Well, I actually didn't find any numbers on that in terms of actual dollars. I did see that there was a big research report done regarding loot boxes, essentially, and it was at Plymouth University, I believe, that published it. And their finding was, this is kind of to confirm the obvious, but they stated, quoting, that loot boxes in video games are structurally and psychologically akin to gambling. That seems obvious, but they did want to actually research it and look into it thoroughly, and they did conclude that it is essentially gambling. There's no functional difference. In regards to children, this is pretty terrifying. 93% of children play video games. That's, as far as I could tell, that was the interpretation of the stat they gave. And up to 40% of the children who played video games have opened loot boxes. So that puts you at up to almost 40% of all children having opened loot boxes.
Yeah, but opening loot boxes is a pretty loose definition, because if you play a game that has loot boxes, the norm is to give you free loot boxes to.
That's true, but it's still a total gambling, right? You're earning these loot boxes, and you're getting introduced to this variable reward type.
It's an introduction to the actual
mechanic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you're basically getting, kind of trained. Like, oh, this is a completely acceptable behavior. This is a completely acceptable way to, spend money or get rewarded or whatever. Like, it's just setting them up for that business model. Whether or not they paid in real cash for the loot boxes, I don't see it as being good that you'd have even free loot boxes given out to. It's when the paid version exists, like, if you know what I mean, like the kids
it's an attempt to get them in, right?
You're saying this is where it's relatively clear cut. Finding a solution that leads to the clear cut result where kids aren't exposed to loot boxes is the ideal outcome.
If the loot boxes were only free, I would have less of a problem, because then, in the back of their minds, the kids aren't looking at that and saying, oh, this is something that you can earn, or you can just pay for with cash, right? Like, as soon as you bring into the existence a paid-for version of the loot box, it just changes the game, right? In my mind, because the psychology is different. Like, if you only had free loot boxes where the only way to earn these is to play the game and do whatever, accomplish feats or whatever, it seems less problematic, because you're not saying, oh, this is something you get for just paying cold hard cash and then you get to roll the dice. You're saying, oh, you play the game and then you get, like, variable reward, which is variable reward for video games is, like, they're inseparable, right? You can't, you can, even, like, monsters, or what, you kill a monster, you get, like, a random sword or a piece of equipment. Well, that's variable reward. That's essentially a similar thing to a loot box, just not in a box. My problem is when you put a cash value on it where you can just shortcut the system and pay money for it. That's when the psychology changes in my mind.
Yeah, exactly.
The
and
only thing is, just because all loot boxes are very much the same as each other in every game, I think, like, even if a game had free loot boxes, a person would start up another game. Like, it would have to be applied to, like, all games. Like all games kids could play would have to have not paid for loot boxes or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's another good point. Is that as soon as one game introduces it, it changes the game. It changes the landscape for all games, right? Because now kids go, oh well, this is kind of like the game where you can pay for it, right? It just
My thinking in the West is that in the younger generation, it seems like really Fortnite was like the tipping point where the average kid probably knew how a loot box worked.
Fortnite.
I
Maybe
can't think of huge games targeted at kids before then.
Overwatch was earlier.
Yeah,
It's
but
not as big, I guess.
that had the barrier to entry for children of costing $40.
The other ones I think were probably when much before Fortnite were a lot of the mobile games because, interestingly enough, loot boxes. Most of the revenue generated from loot boxes is mobile games. So
Well, it's actually the whole system used to be called just gacha because it was invented in Japan, and the Japanese had to crack down on it like over 10 years ago because it became such an addictive phenomenon.
yeah. So there was a lot of mobile games like maybe even like Clash of Clans type. I'm so out of the loop.
They were the classic way where you paid to speed things up. I think they probably have loot boxes now because they'd be stupid not to.
So, another big one was FIFA. FIFA introduced their
They started doing the card packs.
Legend card packs. I guess which card packs are a little bit different. It's essentially a loot box. They did that in 2009.
Okay, so that'd probably be the first big mainstream in the West.
Yeah, that's way back in the day. And again, I guess like the first kind of targeted to kids thing was trading cards, for sure. And like it kind of got probably superheated with like Pokemon
and Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah.
The Pokemon and all the clones, right? Because when it was just sports cards, I think was probably fairly limited. And then when it transitioned, like when like Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon, all that shit got introduced, it went nuts, right? Like
once you had a full-on television series to advertise the card games, that's when it's like, man, it's not the other way around like baseball, where it was, oh, you watch baseball, so here's a collectible baseball card. It's like, no, here's a collectible card. Now watch this TV show about it.
So you want to buy the card. Yeah, exactly. Like, so that would have been like the prototype, right? And then it slowly morphed into what we have now. But the other interesting thing from the report was, I don't know if you guys obviously are familiar with whales, the term whale, which is just
people who spend exorbitant amounts of money on video game loot boxes.
Yeah, it's just to denote like the big spenders, and most people had theorized that whales were like what drove a lot of this, and the research confirms that, where they think that about 5% of gamers spend or more of the loot box spending is from 5% of gamers, so those would be the typical whale. Most people don't spend very much on loot boxes. And the interesting thing is, so that the research report that I was reading made a good point, is like, well, you can basically deem those people to be problematic gamblers, moderate to high risk problematic gamblers. And so companies are no longer making money on gamers, they're making money on gamblers.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
They're not targeting gamers anymore. 95% of their audience barely spends any money on their games anymore.
This is the interesting thing that's happened in the last while, because once people realized the existence of whales, they wanted to make games that everyone could whale on, and then those would get absolutely demolished in reviews for being pay to win. And now I think the games that pull in the most revenue from their loot box systems have actually found this balance where they design the game to appeal to gamers so that gamers play it, but then they also add in the loot box elements that whales will spend the money on, because the whales don't want to play a game that no one else plays. They want to play a game and be able to show off their whaling in a game that's very popular. So if you make the most popular game and then happen to also include all these gambling elements, the gamblers come to you and they spend all the money. Like, they're just looking for a place to gamble.
Genshin
Yes,
Impact.
that is true. Although the logic becomes either way, the logic becomes games come second, right? Like the companies are not their premise is no longer make the best game possible. Their premise is now make a game that's good enough people will play it, and then find a bunch of ways to pump whales, right? Like, which obviously I think when a lot of games end up, releasing relatively decent games, and then the microtransactions and whale elements start to like creep up, right? Like they capture a player base, and then they just crank up the pay for loot box.
Well, yeah, that's how you
incentives.
get all the primary sales on the game, right? And then you have an income stream after on the whales.
The example that I think of, like, as exemplifying what I view as sort of the future of gaming is Genshin Impact. Because, like, the whale aspect is there, everyone knows about it, and a ton of people whale on it. But, like, the game is a ridiculous amount of content completely for free that's fun to play. And they've pulled in $1 billion in revenue in 6 months.
Yeah, I feel like there isn't a market for a huge percentage of genre games anymore, because they're not the ones you can get people playing and then come in and whale on, right? Like, it's just, they're not conducive to that. So, like a lot of, say, like RTS strategy games or whatever, it's just, there's no way to really make them in the style, that style that you're talking about, where there's this, basically the only games that are really conducive to that are like multiplayer MMOs, or like big massive multiplayer games where you can see other players and interact with other players consistently, so that you can show off your bling, right?
That, and also a sort of party system is big, where you have characters that you can get, because people like paying for buffs and all that sort of stuff, but they love like getting a parasocial relationship with a fictional character, and then spending tons of money to acquire that fictional character so they can play the game with them in their party. Like, that is a huge part of most of the large whale games.
Yeah, it's just, and I think it's tangent, but like I think single player games are just at the biggest loss, right? Like, because I think it's so much harder to.
You can't justify it to a corporate
convince-
board, right? You have to say,
Well, it's just to convince the player base to pay, microtransactions, like, and loot boxes in a single player game is just a non-starter, and that's the most popular monetary model in gaming now. And it's like, well, so basically single player games are out, just not
pretty much.
viable. Is so.
oh yeah, there's
It's
been a
just
few
like
pretty successful ones, but a lot of them.
Yeah, but not as successful as EA FIFA since 2009, where they fucking print money by literally copy and pasting this code over and over year after year, spending no money on development and just shitting out money. Like, it's just
In
Exactly.
6 years, FIFA has made $6 billion in revenue.
exactly, like they just print money with no effort, and why wouldn't they? Like, so there's no incentive to spend $250 million developing a absolute beautiful single player game or whatever, and make $350 million when you can spend $10 million copy and pasting your code from the last year and print $1 billion.
Yeah,
It's like-
exactly. It's like a tenth the
It's just-
effort and 10 times the
It's like-
revenue.
Exactly. Like, why would you? Why, like,
Literally
the
a
risk
hundredfold.
reward-
It's a hundredfold increase.
The risk reward just does not make sense. And how, again, like, you have to bring shareholders and execs, right? Like, you're bringing it to the CEO. Oh yeah, I want to spend $250 million in a game. It may make $350 million. It might make $150 million, right? Oh well, that's a terrible deal for us. We're never going to fund this project. Or you just come and say, yeah, the FIFA 2022, we copy and pasted, and it's done.
Yeah, it's done.
Is licensing the player rights.
Exactly. I'm sure licensing is like far and away the biggest cost for like shit like FIFA and all that. Like, like if people were noticing like I can't remember what it was, like the field stuff had been unchanged. Like fields had got updated in real life, and they hadn't like been changed from one game to the next because they had literally copy and pasted the code.
Yeah, well, they would find in the FIFA 2020, they'd find there'd be logos for FIFA 2019. It was clearly copied and pasted, and and Madden, same thing.
So I mean, all that's to say is like loot boxes super bad for kids, I would say, because it's just introducing gambling to kids. I think that's essentially unjustifiable from any level. And then on top of that, it just completely, I mean, it's minor in comparison to the fucking kids over point, but it does also just make the video game industry much worse in every way.
Yeah,
The year 2030, nobody does anything in life except for the express purpose of gambling on it with cryptocurrencies. It's like video game is just the vanguard. Everything in life will become about gambling.
It does seem like gambling is slowly kind of creeping in. Like it, you know. I think it would have been. It seemed to sneak up on us, right? Like, if you would have told, say, take the loot boxes as an example, if you would have told people, well, like, the whole gaming industry is going to be centered around gambling, you said that in, like, 2000, people would be like, what? Like, that makes no sense. Like, that how would that ever happen? And now it is. Like, the whole gaming industry is basically just an extension of the gambling industry. I could see it creeping in further and further, and I don't think that's good for anyone.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And really, the only scenario that I see it working is just government straight up banning loot boxes, just saying no, this is gambling, and because children it's too hard to control for it, it's just banned. Like, you're not allowed doing it here, and I think you would need multiple.
It just seems so hard to think of a system that does it both ways and allows like gambling for adults but not for children.
Yeah, exactly. It just seems like but I have a feeling. Well, there are some nations. I think Australia, or maybe is it New Zealand, and the UK. They're looking into loot boxes. They do know that there is a problem. Like politicians are beginning to come out.
Belgium has banned them.
Yeah, so like that's a good step that helps, and Belgium is seen as a reasonable country. So hopefully, like, I do think loot boxes in video games is probably something. I don't like government interference as much as possible, but I do feel like loot boxes is one of those things where it's probably better for it just to be banned overall, because it just seems like you're not going to be able to control for kids.
How are you gonna tell the Chinese companies not to put loot boxes in their games? People are just gonna VPN to play on the China servers.
Yeah, but then like,
to be fair, if the CCP decided loot boxes were bad for children, then there would be no loot boxes.
No, I'm trying to. I think that is something I could reasonably see them test piloting, or hope they test pilot, is just a straight ban, because I agree. For video games, it's like, what? It's just so ludicrous to think that children aren't like a massive part of the industry, right? Like, there's just no conceivable way you can say, well, we're gonna segment out kids out of video games. Like, it's stupid to think you can do that. So I don't see how you get, like you said, like, pick and choose between adults and kids, etc. And I just don't see there being a justification for keeping it. It's like, are adults like really well served by having loot box exist?
Hey, they couldn't get those cosmetics any other way.
Yeah, like, it's just it's not like you're hurting adults really in a meaningful way. It's not like there's a big downside to banning them. Like, there's, it's not like some of those things where there seems to be a big trade-off on the other side for the only big trade-off is gaming companies losing revenue, and
Exactly.
to that, like, fuck them, like, you know, I don't care. I do think, yeah, I do think that will be hopefully something that happens. Especially if maybe the EU even, because the EU has had success bringing in kind of EU-wide legislation, you know, on certain things where companies just decide to adopt it even outside of the EU just for ease, right? Like, it's the EU is such a big market, they follow what the EU requires, and then they just, you know, that's their kind of worldwide standard.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I do have some hope if the EU starts to follow Belgium's lead. I'm of the same opinion. I think that the real only upshot to loot boxes that you can even reasonably argue is that these big game companies just make more money. Like, and you know, like, you can be cynical about that, but they do employ huge amounts of people and whatnot. Like, they would eventually have to cut some people and let them go. Like, there is that, but I feel at the same time, okay, well, yes, you would lose some jobs, but I think overall that's a lot better than pretty much being responsible for zeroing out the bank accounts of a ton of, you know, gambling addicts, and then also causing, I would say, full-time or lifelong gambling problems in children potentially. I can't see if you're a loot box addict at 12 years old not having issues with it for the rest of your life. Like,
one, I guess, like, this argument you can make is whales subsidize the rest of us.
Yeah, that's true.
That's my argument.
Kind of cynically self-interested, you might say, you know, I love whales. They, you know, they spend thousands of dollars a year on games. I spend zero, pretty much, and I get a bunch of good quality games for free because these people are, you know, subsidizing me. Even that argument, I feel like, is, I guess, very, how would you put it, subjective, based on, in my personal opinion, games have gotten worse in the last 5-6 years because of this overall. So, I mean, I don't see the non-whales benefiting. The other interesting thought that I've had is, like, if we do see loot boxes get banned cross-wide, we might see potentially the fall of some cryptocurrencies being gambling. That's just kind of my speculation. Is
people will move into that.
Well, it's just like the government needs a reason. Like, a lot of governments are looking for a reason to ban cryptocurrency or highly regulate them, or ban and regulate, you know, bring in their own cryptocurrency that's highly regulated and ban all other ones. And I think a very classic justification for that is going to be, you know, these things are causing societal harms, and a huge point of evidence that they might use is gambling, right? They're going to say, you know, and we've already discussed it multiple times on this podcast, is like, cryptocurrency is being used for gambling. It is, without a doubt, not just directly with people, you know, releasing a bunch of shit coins for people to gamble on for fun. As basically they're Ponzi schemes, you know, just a whole bunch of Ponzi schemes, and people are, you know, just throwing their money in to see if they can time their exit and make a quick buck, right? But they're also facilitating, you know, actual, you know, online casinos, etc., etc. And so governments might come along and say, you know, look at cryptocurrency is causing all these societal harms. We need to ban it, or we need to just strictly regulate it, or we need to track everyone who uses it, etc., etc. We can't have kids gambling using cryptocurrency, therefore we have to, you know, anytime you have a cryptocurrency transaction, you need to show your ID, and that needs to be sent to a central database, and we need to be in charge of that central database, and blah, 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 aka defeating the whole purpose of cryptocurrency in the first place, right?
Yeah, I don't have much else to add there, but I agree. I think it's one of these new interesting problems, and it would be kind of sad to see the government fuck with crypto in some ways. I do think crypto, there probably needs to be some regulations, because it is absolutely it is just a free-for-all right now, and I think a lot of people are just getting brutally hurt. So, but that is one of the reasons I would be a little bit worried about the government coming in and regulating loot boxes, because anytime the government tries to do something of that, of that sort, they usually make a mess of it and then improperly regulate things and then cause more problems. So, but
Can't wait for the definitely not loot boxes that go through the loopholes.
exactly, it just makes them. They just make it more. They just make it slightly more irritating and then still allow it. You know.
Yeah. That is always the concern. That's governments do. Like, governments are your only option to do a lot of things that you want done, right? Unfortunately, because they're the only option, they often don't have any competition or any incentives to do it very well, and therefore don't. So, I mean, that is always the eternal struggle to get governments to do what you want them to do properly.
Yeah, exactly. It's not to sit there and be like, oh, government sucks at everything. They're all horrible. But you know, they do have a precedent that.
Well, they do have a track record of not.
Yeah,
being
exactly.
the most efficient and the most efficient and forward thinking with their implementation of a lot of things. And I mean, so it is a concern for sure. And I feel the same way about them coming into the crypto markets, because they don't, it's another thing they don't control. So they want to kind of justify themselves weaseling their way in there and cracking down and regulating, etc., etc. And like you said, there probably does need to be some regulation. How much is enough versus how much is government overreach? That's going to be a lot of difficult back and forth trial and error, I think, to find that out.
Yeah, I agree. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to chat about for this? Any other deep dives into the gambling verse?
That mostly sums it up.
Yeah, I do kind of go back to the alcohol analogy, which does seem like gambling. Just not enough people really take it seriously as and like Price was saying before, it seems like a certain percentage of people have pretty hefty predisposition to having trouble with it.
Yeah.
So the more kind of widely accepted and accessible it is, the more of those people with predispositions are gonna encounter it often enough that it becomes,
it becomes a problem.
Yeah, it's opportunity, right? And
yeah.
So maybe we should have society should kind of have a bit of a longer, harder think about how many opportunities we should be giving people, or encouraging people to take, I guess is maybe the better way to say it. I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I'd say is, just to add to that, is it does seem like there really isn't much. People don't really seem to take it seriously at all. It was hard to find research on it. It was hard to find real good research on it. A lot of the people who were talking about treatments and whatnot, just it was stuff that clearly didn't have a ton of funding, and I think it was a lot of people screaming into the storm. So it would be nice to see this turn into a little bit more of a public discussion, because I actually do feel like I've known quite a few people who have struggled with gambling addictions and have really harmed their own lives, and it's not I know that's anecdotal, but it's enough that it really does seem like it would be nice to have the society talk more about it, especially since, like as you said, we're getting many more opportunities for people to, realize their potential predispositions to it, and it could, especially with the crypto and options and whatnot and stock market and whatnot, it would be good to get a handle on this as soon as possible. That's all I got. Anything else, you guys?
That's better.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Peace.